Red Wing, Minnesota. Population 15,000 in the year 2022. Home of the Reverend James Kemp Friedrich, born 1903 to 1966. He was the 19th century pioneer for Christian films.
I had heard about James Friedrich's films for years. You know, he's kind of a legend among people interested in Christian cinema.
I visited Red Wing and, to my surprise, met family members, descendants of Friedrich at Christ Episcopal Church, where he, his parents, and even grandparents attended over 100 years ago.
I beheld his glory.
Yes.
This is the guy that played Jesus. Oh. And so we have this headshot of Jesus. It's one of the stills from the ad campaign or whatever, you know, so shows Jesus with long hair gazing up into the sky, and it's autographed, but damn it, he autographed it as Robert Wilson. I wanted it autographed as Jesus.
Katherine Johnson, the great niece of Reverend James K. Friedrich. Interesting, she says they never called him James. He was always known as Uncle Jim.
Died in the 1850s. Wow. When the first Frederick came over from Germany. On my grandmother's side goes back further, but this is, we refer to them as, this is C.E. and this is Catherine Amalia. So those are the parents of Uncle Jim.
Oh, wow.
And this is them later in life. So this is Uncle Jim, short, and his twin. I think that one's Jim, and that's the twin. Louis Bettinas, his name was.
And he passed away.
He died. I think he was about 6 or 8 months old. He had pneumonia. And in the early 1900s, of course, they couldn't treat anything like that.
His family went to an Episcopal church there in Red Wing, and they evidently had a really good priest who took a liking to James. He saw that he was a good kid, but just undisciplined. And that priest, though, kind of took him under his wing and guided him. My impression is that he was really the one that kind of got Friedrich on the straight and narrow, on the right path, the path that Friedrich would take for the rest of his life, going to Hollywood and making movies.
They started a wholesale grocery business together. It's called Friedrich and Kemp. And so what they did is they supplied all the little grocery stores out around the countryside. So the farmers didn't have to come all the way into Red Wing. And that business went through, the name changed after John Michael died. His son, who is C.E., Jim's father, he changed it to C.E. Friedrich and Company. But then he joined with Peter Kemp, one of the Kemp family again, and it went back to being Friedrich and Kemp. And that was the name it stayed until the late 1950s, when my grandfather sold out. Uncle Jim actually started working in the business before he went to seminary. He worked, I believe, as a salesman for the company and went around to sell, get the orders and that for the stores. So he worked in the business for a while and decided it wasn't for him. So he got out. So that's when he went to seminary.
One of my favorite characters is a British writer at the time, G.K. Chesterton, about 300 pounds, great journalist, influenced J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And he came to America. And he came to America and he says, what's wrong with America? He says, what's wrong with the cinema? He says, the cinema comes to places like Oklahoma, which is good. But what is wrong is the cinema doesn't come from Oklahoma to other places. In other words, he was saying, the problem is Christians are not making good art and sending it out. They are just consuming what comes to them from Hollywood. And so Chesterton also gave this kind of indirect call for Christians to get involved in the art of cinema.
Before his cinematic and theological vision, Reverend Friedrich briefly attended the University of Minnesota. Although short-lived, the art of cinema was his ultimate desire.
Trains and the movies. And he kept those hobbies and those interests his whole life. And so growing up in Red Wing, Minnesota, his father was a grocery store owner. And I think that was just a life that was probably a little bit boring for him. I know he wasn't too interested in the grocery business.
He was quite a human guy, and his friend was Walt Disney. They both respected each other's work very much. But Disney was very careful not to make religious films. He left that to his friend Friedrich.
Friedrich felt God calling him into the ministry. And so he went to Virginia Seminary, Episcopal Seminary in Virginia, and completed his training to be a priest.
When Friedrich started, he made short films for Sunday schools, but he became more ambitious, and he really thought of the miniseries long before television did. His series, The Life of St. Paul, was in 12 episodes, and his series, The Life of Christ, was also in 12 episodes, and it took years and years to make, but all of great quality and all very powerful, and those exist to this day.
In the mid-'60s, I lived in the Rhineland district of Germany. My father was an Assembly of God chaplain. And every Sunday night, we would go and watch James Friedrich's Life of St. Paul. And they were like these old movie serials that were cliffhangers. You'd go to the end, and all of a sudden, Paul looks like he's going to be kind of killed, or he's going to be converted, or there are riots in Ephesus. And we would watch those about 30-minute films, and at the end, we were so excited to see what would happen next week. And so we'd come. And so his films kind of tapped in. Now, I came from a denomination that did not approve movies in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And yet, here we were watching movies on a military base that really kind of woke in me kind of this desire to say, I want to see how we can use these films to really share the good news of Jesus Christ.
And then this building was built, the parish hall was built in the early 1900s. Section in here where the offices are, this was built in the 50s. And then we renovated it to add an elevator. To try to make the place accessible. So the two buildings were not connected up until the 50s. So this is what we call the chapel entrance, and we're getting the roof fixed. God.
So you've been here your whole life?
Yes, here, let's get some lights. Come on in. The windows are being renovated. That one was completed, so it's all been re-leaded. There were some broken pieces that have been fixed. So that's the mother of Catherine Friedrich, Catherine Amalia Friedrich. And this is, Hattie Wolf is one of her daughters.
1834.
Yeah.
Catherine gave me the tour of the Christ Episcopal Church, and still to this day, James K. Friedrich parents and grandparents' names are embedded in the stained glass from the 1800s.
So this is Uncle Jim's mother and father. And did I tell you that I did send an email to my cousin Jim?
Okay.
To let him know that we were in.
Okay.
And I asked her if there was anything that was off limits. And he said, no, since the family's quite boring. There's
Cousin Jim, who is actually James L. Friedrich Jr., the son of James K. Friedrich, who now resides in Washington State. We did correspond by email, but I was unable to get an interview. He also a reverend as well as a filmmaker. As a child, he participated in his father's productions.
So Friedrich went from seminary to the Institute of Applied Religion, which is another Episcopal organization. And there he learned about filmmaking and started trying to make some documentaries. But evidently his experience there at the Institute of Applied Religion wasn't so great. And he decided to go out to Hollywood and try to make religious films there. And so that's when he and some investors decided to create this cathedral films company and produce a film called The Great Commandment.
One day he said, "Pastor, you may not know me or remember me, but I know you." And he went back to say, "You came to this church," this was in Singapore, 1966, sometime in November, and had conducted 3 weeks evangelistic ministry, and you showed us some Christian films, and one of those films was The Life of Jesus. And I was not a Christian then, and at the third day of the meeting, you called for commitment. I came and committed myself, and you introduced me to the pastor, and 6 months later, you came back to Singapore and baptized me. I came to know the Lord through that film.
Another thing about Friedrich was he would hire professionals. He would get people that knew their craft and could really kind of make it beautiful, make it powerful. It's like finding a good carpenter. You want someone who knows what they are doing. And so he would bring in these professionals rather than Christian friends who thought they could do something, do the lighting, do the camera, anything else. And so you have these wonderful looking kind of low-key shots on Queen Esther, for example, the film he made. And you realize there is something going on.
Anybody who knew Disney as well as he did must have been exceptionally intelligent and exceptionally creative. And even though he always wore his dog collar on the set and started the shoots with prayers, he was quite open to anybody taking part, either as actors or as camera crew.
One of the reasons Friedrich is considered a pioneer of the Christian film industry is because he forged ahead when other Christian filmmakers gave up. Because the 1920s had been a really exciting period for Christian filmmaking. The motion pictures were silent. Churches could afford to buy silent projectors. Churches were showing films back when lots of churches used to have Wednesday night services. That was a time when they could show a movie. Lots of churches had Sunday night services. That was a time that they could show a movie. It was an evangelism and outreach tool for the church to use to reach people.
Then, in the late 1920s, synchronized sound was introduced. Instantly, all the church's projectors became obsolete.
Suddenly, all these Christian filmmakers that were producing films had to upgrade their equipment and had to try to learn how to use the synchronized sound microphones and recorders, which were expensive and hard to work with. I mean, even the Hollywood studios were having trouble. The Christian filmmakers just didn't have a chance. And so the synchronized sound really killed the nascent Christian film industry. And so then you get the 1930s where Christians aren't really making very many films. Churches aren't interested in buying new projectors. Independent producers really dropped out. But then comes along James Friedrich, and he blows into Hollywood with this kind of naive and idealistic idea that I'm going to come here and start making movies, start making religious movies in Hollywood in a professional way. And he did.
Friedrich aspired to be a great artist, and he chose as his subject matter the stories in the Bible. And he said, I'm going to make these stories realistic. Unfortunately, following him in the 50s, after his day of triumph, you have these biblical spectaculars, such as King of Kings, or The Greatest Story Ever Told, George Stevens' film, which is really the longest story ever told. So Friedrich brought kind of a realism to his film, much like the series today, The Chosen. The Chosen has this kind of delightful reality to it. It's a backstory. And so he was able to kind of tell a story in a conversational sort of way that you found very credible. And it was very moving in the sense because these were not actors. These were not kind of artificial people, but people that were living the life out.
I mean, he was the personality that he pushed it through. He did it. And so he was really a pioneer for that reason. He kind of inspired a lot of other Christian filmmakers who had given up and other young filmmakers who had never tried it to start making movies.
Los Angeles Times, Variety, all of the periodicals out in Los Angeles really praised what he was doing. They said, these are not kind of schlocky little Bible stories we put on bathrobes. Now that time is going to come in the 50s and 60s in the church market, but he is such a pioneer and a visionary for creating quality art.
Well, like I said, I was only 11 when he died. And so my personal memories, I don't have a lot of those. I did get to go to California once. See, my father was on the board of directors for Cathedral Films. So he's one of Uncle Jim's nephews. And so he was so he'd go out there occasionally for some of the board meetings. One year, my sister and I got to go with, and so we rode the train out from Red Wing to Chicago and then out to LA. And he had this, I think it was just an old garage in the back of their yard, and it had been turned into his train house. And so, like as you go in a garage in the service door, when you walked in, that's where the console was to operate his trains. The rest of the building was all train layout.
James Friedrich showed a post-war generation of evangelical Christians that you could make biblically accurate, spiritually nourishing, evangelistic films, and you could make them well. You could make them of high quality. You didn't have to be embarrassed of these films, artistically or theologically. You could get behind Friedrich's films. And that taught a younger generation of filmmakers that came into the business in the 60s and 70s that they could do that. And you see the studios have figured out that there's a market for these kinds of films. You know, you can thank Mel Gibson for that, you know, Passion of the Christ, but you also have to thank James Friedrich for that because he taught us that you can get into the industry and make these films, but you gotta do it well. You gotta do it professionally. He was never able to crack that nut with much success, but his cinematic descendants were able to do that. And that's why you have films today, you know, like Soul Surfer or Risen or Woodlawn. Films being made by Christians with an evangelistic message that are showing at your local theater.
I think Hollywood was really unaware of the religious market for quite a while. There's this kind of quiet audience out there, and when they see something that they like, they will flock to it. It's one of the reasons why I think Mel Gibson and Tyler Perry have been so successful. They've tapped into a group of people that want to hear stories. They want to hear good stories and not be preached at, but within, kind of embedded in these stories is kind of good news. And Friedrich was the one who really kind of set that foundation for him.
And then in the early 60s, Cathedral really just basically stops producing original work. They really just start distributing films being made by other people. And then Friedrich dies a few years later in the mid-60s.
The Episcopal pastor, the evangelist of Hollywood, the influential filmmaker, Reverend James Kemp Friedrich, the 19th century pioneer for Christian films.